My name is Ruby Reed. If someone had only looked at the family photo that used to hang in our living room, they would have thought I had a stable marriage. The house was neat, my husband went to work every day, my wife stayed quiet, and everything looked like it was functioning the way it should. Only I knew what it felt like to have that suffocating pressure seep into every meal, every morning, every night, lying beside a man who never had to raise a hand to crush his wife's self-worth. Tyler Miller had a way of making another person feel so small that they practically disappeared. He didn't need to scream all the time. He only had to repeat one thing over and over until it took root in my head that I was useless, that I was nothing without him, that everything I had, from the roof over my head to the outwardly peaceful life we seemed to have, existed only because he had given it to me. At first, I still reacted. I still tried to explain that I worked too, that I handled things too, that I was the one keeping this house from falling apart. But little by little, I understood that with Tyler, the truth didn't matter. What he needed was someone standing across from him so he could feel bigger. There are kinds of abuse that leave no bruises on the skin, but still make a person look in the mirror and fail to recognize herself. I lived inside that kind of abuse for years. It was low-burning, steady, subtle enough that people on the outside would struggle to call it by its real name. Just a few cutting remarks. Just a few dismissals. Just the slight curl of his lip whenever I said something. But all those things that were just this or just that built up, day after day, into an invisible cage. Eventually, I stopped believing in my own worth. I started apologizing even when I had done nothing wrong. I started weighing every word before I opened my mouth. I started living as if I were a guest in my own life. In reality, I was the one who kept everything running. I remembered when the electric bill was due, when the insurance had to be paid, and which payment was coming up next. I made sure there was food in the fridge, handled the small bills, and dealt with the unexpected expenses. Tyler always treated them as if someone would naturally take care of them. When the washing machine broke, I called the repairman. When the account came up short, I shifted things around, cut one expense, and covered another. When he forgot a relative's birthday, I was the one who bought the gift, wrote the card, and kept those relationships from going cold. But in every story Tyler told other people, he was the one carrying the whole family on his shoulders, and I was just the shadow lucky enough to come along. I used to ask myself why I hadn't left sooner. The answer isn't pretty, and it isn't as brave as people like to imagine. I stayed because I was afraid of everything collapsing before I had any way out. I stayed because fake stability can sometimes feel easier to endure than real chaos. I stayed because every time I even started to push back, Tyler would cut me off in that calm, chilling tone of his. Leave me. And how many days do you think you'd survive? He said it like he was stating an obvious fact, and the worst part was that for a long time, I believed him. The first person to see the truth was Eva Morris. She never saw Tyler humiliate me in our house. She simply noticed the way I shrank every time my phone lit up, the way I chose my words as if I were asking permission to exist. Eva never pushed me to talk. She only asked very quiet questions, but they landed right on the wound in a way I couldn't escape. Why did I always apologize before giving an opinion? Why did I check a message and instantly change expression? Why was someone who used to be lively now living as if she were afraid of bothering everyone in the room? The second person who unsettled me, in a different way, was Stella Morgan, Tyler's mother. She did not openly take my side, and she never exposed her son in front of anyone. But one time, when it was just the two of us in the kitchen, she set down her teacup and said very slowly, "You should keep your documents where you know exactly where they are. For any account with your name on it, you need to know it. Don't put your whole life into anyone else's hands." I felt a chill go through me, not because the advice was too harsh, but because it sounded like a warning from someone who knew Tyler better than I did. I kept trying to go on until that dinner, the dinner that made me understand everything, had reached its limit. A few of Tyler's acquaintances were there, including Jason Collins and Ethan Griffin. Everyone had been talking normally when Tyler turned to me with a smile, as if he were about to tell a funny story. He said I knew nothing about money, that if anyone trusted me with something important, I would probably lose my whole life along with it. The others gave uneasy laughs. Tyler took that as encouragement. He went on to say that I had lived off him for so long that now I imagined I had a voice too. Then, with the last line, he looked straight at me. If Ruby left me, she wouldn't even know where to begin. In the past, words like that would have left me numb with humiliation. But that night, what I felt was no longer shame. It was a coldness clear, sharp, cutting like glass. I sat there listening to each word land, and for the first time, I did not ask myself what I had done wrong. I only realized that a very clear line had just appeared in my mind. If the day came when I left, I would not leave like someone thrown out of his life with nothing. I would not let Tyler keep telling the world that he had fed me, saved me, created me. I would leave on my own terms, taking with me what was truly mine. That night, after I had finished cleaning up, and Tyler went upstairs, with the satisfied look of a man who thought he had won one more time, I stayed in the kitchen to gather a few receipts that had fallen beside his bag. I was not looking for anything. But buried in that pile of loose paper was a bank statement I had never seen before, along with the name of another account, and a sum of money being transferred every month to a place Tyler had never once mentioned. My heart started pounding, not from panic, but because I knew I had just touched the first financial secret he had been hiding. From that night on, I decided I would not keep enduring this for nothing. And for the first time in years, my silence did not come from helplessness. It came because I had started to calculate. After living for so long under a constant stream of humiliation, I realized the most dangerous thing Tyler had done to me wasn't that he had hurt me, it was that he had made me get used to the hurt. At some point, I stopped arguing back. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped hoping he would look at me as if I were a normal human being. But after a certain point, my silence changed. On the outside, I was still the same Ruby, still cleaning, still answering in short sentences, still lowering my eyes when Tyler deliberately said things meant to stab straight through my self-respect. Only I knew that something inside me had started to change. I wasn't quiet anymore because I was exhausted. I was quiet, so I could watch. I started paying attention to the things I had once overlooked because I was too worn down. The way Tyler hid documents in his desk drawer, then moved them when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The way he talked about money as if it were his private territory, even though for years I had quietly contributed to every bill, every savings account, every time I had cut away my own needs, just to keep this house from collapsing. I noticed the moments he would answer the phone and suddenly change his tone, the times he acted overly confident after dinner, the way he would open his laptop and snap it shut the second I walked past. The more carefully I watched, the more I saw a truth I had never been calm enough to recognize before. Tyler was nowhere near as solid as he pretended to be. I also learned how to keep my face perfectly still. That was the hardest part. Some nights, Tyler would stand right there in the kitchen, looking at me with that expression that was half contempt, half pity, and say, "How much longer do you think you can last? Without me, would you even survive 3 days? If you walk out of this house, you'll come back begging at the door." Before, words like that were enough to make my chest tighten with anger and humiliation, but that time, I simply turned away, set my glass down as gently as I could, and let him believe he was still crushing me the way he always had. Tyler smiled the way people do when they're certain they hold all the power. That arrogance blinded him. He had no idea that every time he opened his mouth to belittle me, I woke up a little more. Outside that house, the pieces were starting to fall into place too. One day, Jason Collins, Tyler's longtime colleague, stopped by to drop off a file Tyler had left behind. Jason didn't say anything directly, but the hesitation in his eyes and the offhand comment he let slip. "Things have been pretty tense at the company lately. I'm sure Tyler's under a lot of pressure," stayed with me. Tyler had never once admitted he was under pressure. According to him, everything was always under control. The more he bragged, the more I felt something was cracking underneath it all. Then Madeline Kelly appeared at exactly the moment when I had almost forgotten who I used to be. She didn't give me a grand speech. She just sat with me in a small coffee shop, looked at me for a long moment, and said, "Ruby, some people step on others for so long that they start to think that's what makes them tall. That doesn't mean they're right." Those words stayed with me for days. For the first time in years, I tried to look at myself without seeing myself through Tyler's eyes. I saw a woman who had been worn down, but had not disappeared. I saw that I had poured more into this marriage than Tyler ever wanted to admit. I saw that I wasn't as empty-handed as he had forced me to believe. After that, I started gathering back what was mine. I backed up documents, went through our joint accounts, pulled up old payments, and collected proof of what I had contributed, including the money I had once taken from the tiny inheritance my mother left me to save this household, during the period when Tyler's investment failed, only for him to later tell everyone as if he had carried it all by himself. The more I traced it back, the clearer one bitter truth became. This house, this life, this shell of stability had not been built by Tyler alone. I had held it up too. I had just done it in silence. Just when I had almost pieced together everything I needed, Tyler came home wearing that same smug expression. He opened the refrigerator, pulled out a beer, and said with full self-satisfaction, "I've got a big move coming up. You should remember who you're standing next to. Don't get ahead of yourself." I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't feel afraid. A person standing too high on his own ego never notices the ground splitting open beneath his feet. That night, just after Tyler went into the bathroom, my phone vibrated. It was an unknown number. I answered, and the moment I heard the hesitant introduction on the other end, the blood in my body seemed to turn cold. The caller said they were calling from Tyler's company, and what they were about to tell me was far more serious than anything I had guessed. From Jason Collins's call at the end of the last section, I understood one thing with perfect clarity: the game had moved into a different phase. His voice had been low and hurried, like he was saying something he hadn't fully processed himself. He didn't ramble. He just said Tyler had sparked another major confrontation at work, and this time it wasn't some minor clash or the usual arrogance everyone forced themselves to overlook. People were starting to document everything. People were no longer willing to keep covering for him. I hung up with a cold feeling settling inside me, not because I was afraid, but because for the first time, I could see a collapse in front of me that was no longer vague or hypothetical. After that, little pieces of information started finding their way to me, like shards of broken glass reflecting the same truth. Ethan Griffin sent me a very short message. Tyler had just botched an important decision and then blamed a subordinate for it. Nathan Richardson, who rarely involved himself in other people's family matters, hinted that Tyler was turning the entire department against him with his reckless temper and his habit of treating everyone else like they were beneath him. I didn't need anyone to say more. Once I put the pieces together, I could see the whole picture. Tyler still believed he stood above everyone around him. He still thought that if he talked loudly enough, he could drown out every mistake he made. But the ground under his feet had already begun to crack. The strangest part was that every evening, he still walked into the house wearing the same old face. He still tossed his keys onto the table, still opened the fridge, and complained that dinner was cold, still spoke in that half-commanding, half-condescending tone as if the whole world functioned because he was in it. If I had only looked at the surface, I might have thought Jason had exaggerated. But I started noticing the details Tyler couldn't hide in time. A wrinkled collar. He'd just come through a brutally tense day, the way his eyes slid away when I asked how things were going at work, the calls he was ending faster than he used to. The man who had sat in my house, like a king, was showing his first cracks now, and he knew I was beginning to see them. That was also when I found myself trapped inside a question that still stings when I think about it now. Should I tell Tyler what I know? Should I warn him that his arrogance was about to exact a price? Too many memories rose up at once. I had warned him before. I had reminded him to read emails carefully before firing off an angry response, corrected errors in his financial paperwork, and gently pulled him out of conflicts that should have exploded long ago. Tyler had never thanked me for any of it. He only looked at me the way a man looks at a useful servant and said coldly, "Don't start thinking you're smarter than me." I sat alone in the dark kitchen that night for a long time, and in the end, I understood that my decision to stay silent this time was not cruel. I was not hurting Tyler. I was simply no longer cushioning his fall. A man who had spent years trampling his wife did not deserve to keep being rescued just because that wife still had a conscience. For the first time in my life, I allowed the consequences to find the person who had created them. The change in me must have been more visible than I realized. 2 days later, Tyler threw a stack of financial documents onto the table in front of me and told me to sign them. His voice was blunt and familiar, as if this were simply my obvious duty. But this time I didn't pick up the pen right away. I turned each page slowly, read through them, then asked, "What is this transfer for? Why is money being moved from the joint account into this one?" Tyler froze for exactly one beat, then his face darkened. "You don't need to understand it, just sign." I kept my voice calm. "My name is on these papers. I have the right to understand." He laughed, the kind of laugh that made the other person feel insulted. "You think you can even read this stuff, Ruby? Don't put on an act with me." If I had still been the Ruby I used to be, I probably would have gone quiet and signed just to avoid a long, vicious tirade. But I set the papers down, looked him straight in the eye, and said, "I'm not signing anything I don't fully understand." The air in the kitchen turned thick. Tyler stepped closer, and the look in his eyes changed completely. It was no longer the usual contempt. It was caution. As if, for the first time, he realized the woman standing in front of him was no longer obediently frozen in the place he had assigned her. That night, they asked where I had gone, who I had seen, and why my phone had a new passcode. He looked at my calendar longer than usual, picked through every answer I gave him, like he was searching for proof of betrayal. I could almost see the panic growing inside him, a man who was used to controlling everything, beginning to smell the scent of losing control. From that night on, I moved my important documents somewhere safe. I kept separate copies of everything connected to our accounts, the house, and the insurance. I was no longer preparing for an argument. I was preparing for an explosion. Every piece had fallen into place. Tyler's job was in danger. There were dark patches in our finances he did not want me to see, and his instincts were pushing him to tighten his grip on me before everything slipped out of his hands. Then that afternoon, the front door opened earlier than usual. I was standing at the sink when I heard footsteps heavier than they normally were. I turned around, and the moment I saw Tyler's face, I knew the thing I had been waiting for had finally happened. That afternoon, Tyler came home earlier than usual. I hadn't even turned around yet when I heard the door slam open hard enough to hit the wall. That sound alone told me exactly what had happened. Not because I was guessing, but because for weeks, I had already seen this day racing toward us. His face was flushed red, the veins in his neck standing out, his eyes full of the rage of a man who had just had the last shell of power ripped away from him. Tyler threw his briefcase onto the floor and pointed straight at me as if I were the cause of everything. "Happy now, Ruby. Ever since I married you, my life has done nothing but go downhill. You're nothing but bad luck, clinging to other people and draining every bit of their fortune. I'm exhausted enough at work, and then I come home, and still have to look at your useless face." I stood there and looked at him. Every time before this, my heart would have dropped. I would have panicked, scrambling for something, anything, to calm him down. But this time, I no longer felt any need to save anything. I only saw a truth standing there so clearly it was almost naked. Tyler had never needed a reason to humiliate me. He only needed somewhere to dump his anger whenever life stopped going the way he wanted. He stepped closer, his voice growing more vicious with every word. "If I didn't have to carry you, I wouldn't be like this. Do you know how people look at me? A man comes home from work and has to look at his wife like she's a debt hanging around his neck." I set the glass I had been drying down on the table, slowly enough that even Tyler hesitated for a beat. I didn't cry. I didn't ask him to stop. I just said, very evenly, "You didn't lose your job because of me. You lost your job because other people finally saw who you really are." The words hit him like a slap across the face. He froze for a second, then truly lost control. Tyler shouted that I was being disrespectful, that I had clung to him for all these years and now I dared to open my mouth. But in that exact moment, I knew the time had come. I walked straight into the study and took out the document bag I had prepared in advance. Inside were my personal papers, bank statements, records of the money I had contributed to our joint account, the bills, and the documents with my name on them from all those years. I opened my phone and carried out the final steps. I had checked over carefully again and again, transferring the portion of money that legally belonged to me out of the joint account. No more, no less. I didn't take a single dollar from him that wasn't mine. I was only taking back the part of my life I had been forced to pay into this marriage, like some invisible tax. Tyler charged after me, yanking drawers open as if making enough chaos would somehow put everything back where it used to be. What the hell do you think you're doing, Ruby? Where do you think you can go? Do you really think you could survive a single day without me? I turned and looked at him. For the first time in years, I did not feel small in front of that man. I didn't make it through all these years because of you, Tyler. I survived in spite of you. He went dead still. I saw that moment, clearly, the moment Tyler realized my voice no longer belonged to the wife who had stood behind him for years, swallowing everything in silence. He ground out every word, saying everything in this house was his, saying I would crawl back the second I stepped outside. I zipped up my bag, picked up the last stack of documents, and stayed so calm it was almost cold. You're not just losing your job, you're losing the only person who quietly cleaned up every mess you made and pretended everything was fine. Eva Morris texted me just as I reached the door. She was already waiting downstairs. An hour earlier, Stella Morgan had called too, her voice firm and brief, telling me to leave today, not to give a man in free fall the chance to turn me into his final target. I listened. I didn't hesitate anymore. The moment my hand touched the doorknob, Tyler changed his tone. From shouting to threatening, from threatening to bitter pleading, so fast it was sickening. He said I was cruel. He said I had chosen the very day he lost his job to stab him in the back. I didn't turn around. No, I wasn't stabbing him. I was just no longer lying down, so he could keep stepping on me. The door closed behind me more softly than I expected. The second I stepped out of that house, I took one long breath, and it felt like my chest was opening for the first time in years after being starved of air. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt my body go cold with exhaustion and light with the relief of finally getting out. Eva took me to a temporary place to stay. The moment I sat down and set the document bag beside me, my phone started vibrating. Tyler's name lit up the screen. I let it ring. Less than a minute later, the second call came in, then the third, then the fourth. I stared at the string of notifications filling the screen and understood one thing with absolute clarity. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only changed shape. I thought that once I walked out of that house, everything would finally go quiet. I was wrong. Some cages aren't made of wood or iron. They're made of a voice, of memory, of fear trained into your body over the years. Tyler wasn't standing in front of me anymore, but he dragged that old cage right into my phone. On the first day after I left, Tyler called 12 times. On the second day, 21. By the third, it hit 30. He called early in the morning, in the middle of the day, just as I was drifting off, and again at midnight. Some calls I cut off as soon as the phone started ringing. Some I let vibrate until they died on their own. Some came with voicemails so long that before I even reached the end, my chest had already tightened. 1 minute, his voice was hard, calling me a traitor. The kind of woman who waits for her husband to fall, so she can rob him blind. The next, he softened, calling me baby, asking if I'd eaten, as if he had never spent years crushing my self-worth sentence by sentence in our own kitchen. The scariest part wasn't what he said in each call. It was how familiar it all was. I only had to hear the first few lines to know exactly what was coming next. Begging, resentment, blame, threats, then the victim act. The same old cycle, except now I was standing outside it, clear-headed enough to see the pattern I used to be trapped inside. And still, every time the phone rang, my hands went cold. My body remembered faster than my mind did. It remembered the nights he stood blocking the door. It remembered the way he threw the words, "You're nothing without me," in my face. It remembered what it felt like to wake up every day trying to guess what would set him off this time. Madeline Kelly was the first person to pull me out of that old reflex. She sat beside me, holding my phone, speaking slowly, like she was teaching me how to breathe again from the beginning. "Save everything," she said. "Don't delete a thing. The texts, the missed calls, the voicemails, all of it. Don't answer when you're shaking, and definitely don't explain yourself to someone who's only calling to drag you back into the same place you used to live in." That snapped something awake in me. For years, I had thought that if I could just explain myself clearly enough, I would finally be understood. But with Tyler, explanation was never a road to truth. It was just the door he used to twist the story again. So I started saving everything. Every recording, every message, Every abrupt change in tone was chilling enough to make my skin crawl. In the morning, he texted, "Ruby, please. Let's talk like adults." By the afternoon, and it had become, "You think you can run off with the money and be at peace?" By night, "If you have any conscience left, stop ruining my life." I read those messages and laughed, bitter enough it hurt my throat. The man who had wrecked this marriage from beginning to end was now trying to dress himself up as the innocent one who'd been cruelly abandoned. Then Jason Collins called me. His voice was lower than usual, and I could hear the disgust in it. He said Tyler had already started telling people that I waited until he lost his job, cleaned out all the money, and walked away. He'd even added that I'd been planning it for a long time. At first, some people believed him because the story was just believable enough. The quiet wife who said nothing for years suddenly recast as the cold-hearted woman who stabbed her husband in the back. I sat there in silence for a few seconds. That was the most painful part of all for people who live quietly. When they finally speak late, people are quick to believe they're just making excuses. But this time was different. I didn't just have my feelings anymore. I had bank statements, documents, text messages, recordings, data, and timelines so clear that Tyler couldn't bend them into whatever shape he wanted. I didn't need to run around defending myself to the whole world. I just needed the truth to stay where it was long enough, and his lies would tear open on their own. A few days later, I found out Tyler had moved back in with his mother. That news came with another detail that mattered even more. His friends were starting to avoid him. No one said it to his face, but invitations became less frequent, and job leads suddenly dried up. Tyler thought he was just going through a streak of bad luck, but it was the way he reacted that sent everything falling faster. A man can lose his job and still rebuild his life. A man who loses his job and then turns around and bites everyone who won't pity him is the one burying what little remains of his reputation. I didn't need to smear Tyler. He was doing that faster and more thoroughly than anyone else ever could. What I felt wasn't exactly satisfaction, and it wasn't pain anymore either. It was more like standing there and watching a house that had been rotten from the inside finally collapse, loud, messy, covered in dust, but not surprising. Then Stella Morgan called me. I froze when I saw her name on my screen. Through all the years I'd been Tyler's wife, Stella had always been quiet. She never defended me, but she rarely got involved either. Her silence had hurt me because it felt like its own kind of turning away after seeing everything clearly. So when I heard her voice rougher and more exhausted than I remembered, I knew something had changed. She didn't waste time. She asked if I was all right, then hesitated for a long time. I could hear her exhale on the other end, heavy like someone who had been carrying a stone inside her chest for too many years. She said Tyler was living at her house now, and that what she had seen over the past few days had made it impossible for her to keep lying to herself. Then her voice dropped, almost to a whisper. "Ruby, there's something about Tyler I should have told you a long time ago." The way Stella hesitated was enough to make my heart turn cold. Stella's call came at the exact moment I thought I finally understood everything about Tyler. I was sitting in my car outside work, staring at the screen crowded with missed calls, when her name appeared. I hesitated for a few seconds. In my mind, Stella had always been a woman caught between two sides, someone who knew her son was wrong, but was always one step too late to face the truth. I answered, and her voice was rough, like she hadn't slept in days. She didn't waste time. "Ruby, there's something you need to know. I should probably have told you a long time ago." That one sentence alone made my throat go dry. Then Stella told me, slowly and painfully, that Tyler had not become this way after marrying me. He had looked down on women for a very long time since he was young, in those half-joking, half-serious remarks about how women should know how to serve, know how to stay quiet, know how to endure. Tyler had told his mother that a good wife was a woman who knew how to make her husband feel important, even when he had nothing to be proud of. Stella admitted she had heard it back then, had felt disturbed by it, and then soothed herself with the excuse that young men were impulsive and would grow out of it. I sat there motionless, hearing every word like tiny shards of glass pressing into the old years of my life. For so many years, I had asked myself what I had done wrong. I changed the way I spoke, changed my schedule, even changed the way I breathed inside my own home so I wouldn't set him off. And yet the more I gave in, the more Tyler pushed. The quieter I became, the crueler he got. That was when I finally understood. I had never had a chance to fix something he had never considered wrong in the first place. I hadn't married a man with a temporary temper problem. I had married a kind of personality that had been tolerated for far too long. Stella's voice caught as she went on. She said the family had covered for Tyler with all the familiar excuses that he was all talk, that all men had pride, that marriage would make him mature. Every time they did that, they ignored one more warning sign. Every time they did that, Tyler learned that if he was loud enough and stubborn enough, the whole family would back down just to keep the peace at home. I thought I was protecting my son, she said, but really, I was pushing him farther away from the decent part of himself. I didn't know what to say. I was angry at Tyler, but in that moment, I also felt another kind of coldness run down my spine. My tragedy was not an accident. It had been growing for years before I ever stepped into that marriage. Then Stella told me about the days after Tyler moved back in with her. I had thought losing his job, losing his home, losing face would force him to reflect. But no. He lived off his mother as if the whole world owed him an apology. He ate the meals she cooked, and then sat there telling the neighbors that I had betrayed him at the lowest point of his life. He blamed the company, his friends, me, bad luck, everything except himself. Stella said there were days when she gently suggested that maybe Tyler should stop calling me, should start looking for work, should calm down. He slammed his hand on the table and shouted, "You always take the outsider's side. Ruby is going to pay for humiliating me." After hearing that, part of me ached for a mother who was finally being forced to face the truth about her own son. But the rest of me had never felt clearer. If I softened now, I would only be opening the door for the exact same cycle to come back. 2 days after that call, things escalated. Tyler wasn't just calling anymore. He started showing up near my workplace. The first time, I saw his car parked across the street, engine still running, like a deliberate reminder that he was still watching me. The second time, Ethan Griffin noticed him before I did. Ethan pulled me farther inside the lobby and lowered his voice, telling me not to go anywhere alone for the next few days. That evening, I called Nathan Richardson. He listened carefully, then told me with the calm of someone who had seen too many terrible things that from this moment on, I needed to save everything: calls, messages, license plates, times he appeared, all of it. "You're not reacting emotionally anymore," he said. "You protect your boundaries with evidence." So I did exactly that. And then the voicemail that came in at the end of that day pushed everything into an entirely different place. At first, Tyler's voice softened, almost pleading. He said he was in trouble, drowning in debt, that several credit cards were already beyond what he could pay off. He said he just needed me to pick up, just needed me to come back and talk to him like we used to. But only seconds later, his tone changed completely. He bit out every word and said that if I kept ignoring him, he would make sure I got no peace, that he would come find me wherever I was, that he would make me understand what it felt like to lose everything. I listened to that entire message in silence. Strangely, I wasn't shaking anymore. I didn't feel that old sensation of being dragged back down into the same familiar pit. I only felt a line appear in my mind, so sharp and unmistakable that there was no way to misread it. This was no longer a broken marriage. This was a threat that needed to be ended the right way. That night, I locked my phone's screen, sat for a long time in the quiet room, and understood that the next time I faced Tyler would be unlike any time before. This time, he was going to come face to face with a version of Ruby he had never truly seen, and I was ready to make sure the game ended. After Stella's call, I no longer saw this as just the story of a broken marriage. Tyler had gone too far for too long, and the most dangerous part was that he still believed he had the right to drag me back into my old place, the one where I kept my head down and let him define my worth. I didn't want to argue with him one more time. I didn't want another midnight call, another text that was half threat and half plea, or another twisted version of the story he could tell to paint me as cruel. This time, I decided to end it with the truth. I spent nearly 2 days putting everything in order. Statements from our joint accounts, the house documents, records of the money I had contributed over the years, the times Tyler had pulled money out without asking, and then turned around and called me a freeloader. I printed out the messages where he cursed at me, the voicemails full of threats, the ones where he switched from humiliating me to begging me within minutes. Eva helped me sort everything into folders. Jason put me in touch with a legal advisor so I would know exactly what boundaries needed to be set immediately. I wasn't preparing like a wife going to fight with her ex-husband. I was preparing like someone who had finally understood that if she didn't protect herself, no one else would do it for her. The meeting was arranged at Jason's lawyer's office. There were cameras at reception, witnesses present, and enough distance that Tyler couldn't use that old tactic of standing too close and looking down at me like he used to. On the way there, my hands were ice cold, but my mind felt strangely clear. I knew I wasn't going there to vent my anger. Anger had burned through me for years, and it had never saved me. Today, I was there to cut off the last bit of control Tyler still thought he had over me. When Tyler walked in, I realized he had changed not in a way that made me pity him, but because for the first time, I could see how empty he really was. He still tried to make himself look bigger than he was, still wore that familiar arrogant expression, but one look into his eyes told me he was panicking. The moment he sat down, he started talking, as if getting the first word would somehow give him the advantage again. He said I was heartless. He said I had waited until he lost his job to take the money and walk out. He said that if I hadn't left the house, he wouldn't have fallen apart so quickly. Then he gave a dry laugh and said I was playing the victim far too late, because without him, I was nothing. Years ago, that sentence could have silenced me for a week. But that day, under the cold white lights, with stacks of evidence in front of me, it sounded like the voice of a drowning man who still thought he was standing on solid ground. I waited until he finished. Then I opened the folders one by one and slid them toward the lawyer, toward Jason, and toward Tyler. I pointed to every payment I had made toward the house, every bill I had carried when he was spending money polishing his image in public. I opened the printouts of the messages where he called me useless, a burden, someone nobody wanted. I played the voicemail where he said he would make everyone believe I was a gold digger. The room went so quiet, I could hear my own breathing. Tyler changed his tone immediately. He said he had only spoken that way in the heat of the moment. He said every married couple said hurtful things. When he saw that no one was defending him, he turned to Stella, who was there at the lawyer's suggestion as a witness to the times he had shown up at her house and kept harassing me. Mom knows she left me right when I lost everything. Stella sat with her back straight, both hands resting on her knees. She looked at Tyler for a long time, long enough that it felt as if she were looking back over all the years she had lied to herself and called her son merely hot-tempered. Then she said, slowly and clearly, "Ruby didn't take your life away. She just stopped letting you trample over hers." I saw Tyler's face freeze. That was the moment he understood it. The story he had built for himself had just lost its last support. I looked him straight in the eye and said the words I should have said years ago. "I did not ruin your life. I simply refused to keep being the rug you stood on so you could feel taller. Every year, you tore me down to cover your own insecurity. Every time you said I created no value, you were trying to erase everything I had poured into that house, into that life, into the whole shell of success you loved to wear. You didn't lose me the day I left. You lost me the day you decided your cruelty was power." I stated my final terms clearly. The harassment ends now, the smearing stops now, and from this point on, all contact goes through lawyers. If there was one more threatening call or one more lie, I would submit every piece of evidence I had. Tyler tried to cut in, but this time, no one let him take over the room. Even the silence was on my side. I walked out of there feeling not victorious, but lighter, as if a stone that had been crushing my chest for years had finally been lifted. I got to the door, my hand just touching my phone, when the screen lit up, an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. The voice on the other end was shaking and rushed. "Is this Ruby Reed? I'm calling from the hospital. You need to come here right away. Tyler Miller has been in an incident, but more importantly, before he was taken into emergency care, he said a name and it wasn't yours." I went still for several seconds. That journey didn't really end on the day Tyler lost his job, or even when he had to move back into Stella's house with 2 suitcases and nowhere to put all his bitterness. It ended on a very ordinary morning, while I was making coffee before work, when my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I stared at the screen for a few seconds before answering. The man on the other end sounded calm. He introduced himself as the person handling the file related to the harassment complaint I had submitted with Ethan. He kept it brief. Tyler had been formally warned after he continued calling and sending messages to a few old acquaintances, twisting the truth about me. He had been required to sign an agreement to stop all harassing contact and to accept the consequences if he did it again. There was no dramatic scene, no violent crash of everything falling apart. Just a very ordinary confirmation that the boundary I had built had finally been recognized by the law for what it was and protected the way it should have been. I thanked him, hung up, and stood still by the kitchen counter for a long time. I had always assumed that if I ever heard news like that, I would feel triumphant, like I had finally won a fight I'd been forced to stay in for years. But what filled my chest instead was a strange kind of lightness, as if someone had lifted an invisible boulder off my shoulders, one I had carried for so long that I had forgotten my body was ever meant to stand upright. Justice, it turned out, wasn't watching the person who hurt you get crushed. Justice was reaching the point where fear no longer had the right to control the rhythm of your heartbeat. I thought of Eva. If she hadn't sat across from me that day, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "You're not too sensitive. You're being worn down day by day," I might still have been stumbling around, asking other people to confirm that my pain was real. I thought of Madeline, who always pulled me back from those emotional spirals that made me want to argue to the bitter end, just to remind me that my worth did not increase, because I managed to win a fight with someone determined to make me feel small. I thought of Ethan, who helped me understand that getting out of a toxic relationship can't be built on determination alone. It also takes knowledge, paperwork, procedure, and a clear head. And I thought of Nathan, who didn't say much, but whenever he did, he brought everything back down to solid ground, so I wouldn't get swept too far away by my emotions and lose sight of what needed to be done. Even Stella came to mind in a different way. She couldn't erase the years I endured, no one could. But in the end, she stopped standing in the middle. She stopped calling wrongdoing by the softer name of temperament. That change came too late to heal everything, but at least it kept the wrong from being sheltered any longer, as if it were something that could be forgiven forever. And Tyler, for the first time in many years, he was no longer the center of my thoughts. He was still the same unemployed, desperate man, living with his mother and clinging to calls no one wanted to answer anymore. But that was only his situation now. It was no longer my prison. I used to think revenge meant watching him suffer. Now I understand that what defeats a man like Tyler most is not me shouting louder than he does. It's me moving forward without needing him to explain himself, validate me, or drop to his knees and apologize. That afternoon, I got another call from Tyler's old number, the 30th something call that day, maybe more. I had stopped counting. My phone vibrated on the table, the screen lighting up like an old habit trying one last time to force its way into my new life. I looked at his name, and inside me there was only stillness. No anger, no shaking, no curiosity. Just a kind of clarity I had never had before. I blocked the number. Then I set my phone down, picked up my coffee, now half cold, opened the door, and stepped outside. The road in front of me was still the same road I walked every day. It was no brighter than it had been yesterday. But I knew something had changed completely. I was no longer living inside the story Tyler had written for me. I had never been the nothing he spent years telling me I was. I had simply stayed too long in a dark room. So long that I forgot I carried light too. And the day I truly became myself again, it turned out, began in that kind of peace.